So if everyone can pull out your laptops again, and we're going to go to this website. And yep, pitch for our website, but guess what we've done? We had you go to the CBO before to pull out the budget and economic outlook. We had you go to Fred to look for some of this data. Well, I want you guys to bookmark this website, because what we've done is we've started to put all of these things together for you. And all of these websites and names here should be ones that you're all absolutely familiar with. We've got the CBO for our official scorekeepers on spending. JCT is we're looking at revenues. We've got the BEA, as Parker had talked about. This is where we're getting our GDP, our national accounts, our consumer spending, looking at exports and imports. Then we've got BLS. We've got our former commissioner over on the side here, but we're looking at our inflation numbers, our jobs numbers, looking at wages and productivity. Census, so we've got our demographics, where are the people living, and the information from there. Then OMB, because we've also want to make sure we're being aware of the executive budget as we're looking at some potential information. Who here is familiar with Congressional Research Service, CRS? Yeah, one of the tools that we have up here is an appropriations tracker where we can look for things. I'm pitching them because I used to work there as well. And if you're not familiar with your appropriations tracker, it's a great resource and tool. And finally, Fred. All of the data that we're talking about, you can reference from Fred here. So how many people have that website up and in front of them right now? Okay, let's click into CBO in a moment. And it should look like this. So you've got your primary access points. These are going to be your key files. They're going to take you to the key pages on the website. And here we are. So how many people were taking a minute before trying to find this web page?
I was.
Yeah. Now guess what? We've got it in front of you. I'm not going to jump into the Excel at a moment, but if we click on By the Numbers PDF, how many people can see this here? So let's talk about some of these CBO numbers for a second. In the last 50 years, revenues have averaged 17.3% of GDP, with individual income taxes as 8%. They're saying by 2035, we're going to have individual income taxes be 10% of GDP. That, mathematically, that's about 300 billion more that's going to be in there. Now, does that sound like a reasonable assumption? Maybe we should ask. But these are things that you can look at this data, you can stop to understand it, see where we are, and use these numbers, whether it's the CBO or any of those key reference links I provided you. This is going to be helpful data that's going to allow you to better craft your request to the CBO. So now we've walked through this, and before we jump into the workbook, I want to stop. How does good data improve our score? Well, first, again, we want to make sure we're defining our baseline. So if we're talking about the potential changes in revenue, there are things we have to be mindful of. How many people are familiar with the one OB3 that came through? Well, what provisions were in there that might change revenues? Well, we had changes to overtime and tips on how they were taxed. We had changes to state and local taxes, SALT deductions. These are things that we have to be mindful of, because if you start calculating your revenue and your projections prior to OB3 relative to post OB3, your values are going to be very different if you haven't defined your baseline. So you want to make sure you're understanding what your baseline is when we put this request together. Understanding the timing. We talked about the impact of revisions. We talked about the impact of the length of this score. Another thing that's important to understand is, when does this take effect? Are we saying this is immediately? Is this next year? Is this something that we slowly phase in and slowly phase out? These are important questions to be mindful of when we're looking at this and putting the data together. Your score is going to be based off of the legislative language and the understanding of it. So be clear when you draft this letter to move it forward and everything else. Clear assumptions. Again, In economics, we assume things. You want to know what? Hey, we've solved some Social Security. We're assuming everybody drops dead at 68. Okay? I don't think that's a reasonable assumption, but let's be mindful of it. How are people going to incorporate potential assumptions into their data? And this is something that we want to be mindful of. And this is where Parker was talking about with some of these interactions of supply and demand. How many people want to hope to buy a house in the future? You know, the supply of housing is incredibly inelastic. So as we drive more and more people and give them money to buy houses, this just drives up the price. We're not increasing the supply here. So it's something to be mindful of. Now, I'm going to pitch Dr. Shepard's paper. On our website, if you go back to publications, he has a great paper that breaks out some of the economic intuition of the CBO and JCT scores and understanding it. It gets into some of the economic details and some of the economic intuition behind it. As you're starting to draft a letter, I recommend you spend a little bit of time, look at his paper, and think about how you're going to think critically to ask this question. And finally, knowledgeable interactions. Parker was talking about hot dogs and hamburgers. Price of hot dogs go up. Hey, maybe I buy less hot dogs and I buy more hamburgers. These are called substitute goods. But as the price of hot dogs go up, you know what might also fall in sales? Mustard. Well, I'm not buying as much hot dogs. People are going to buy less mustard. People are buying more hamburgers. People might buy more ketchup. I also want bacon on my burger. So these are things that are going to be impacts so that you're being aware of these knowledgeable interactions on things that are going to go forward. How does the change in one impact another? These are assumptions you want to be mindful of, be aware of, and understand. Now, I'm not asking you to solve these problems. I'm asking you to be mindful of them so that when you're drafting that CBO letter, you're going to be spot on. You're going to ask clearer questions. You're going to identify some potential questions around assumptions, or you're going to outline what data might be referenced. Again, back to Parker's presentation, why are you using CPIU versus chain CPIU? Why are we using CPI in relative to maybe PCE, personal consumption expenditures, looking at growth? When we're looking at a growth rate, why are you assuming a 2% growth rate relative to 2.8? All of these impact and changes are going to impact your score. Now, before I move off this, what I'm going to have us do is I've created a draft workbook for all of us to kind of look at how some of these potential changes can impact things.